Pay close attention. What you're about to see is Bible prophecy being fulfilled.
Welcome to another edition of YPN News, bringing you the news that relates to Bible prophecy and foretold by Yishroel Hawkins. Well, in the news this week, President Trump makes his decision on the climate agreement, and that has a couple people making decisions on their own. Also, North Korea is another step closer to its goals, and we'll look at an interesting interview with President Vladimir Putin and some of his comments regarding that Syrian gas attack of the sarin gas attack in Syria. Right. Well, these stories and more, but first, have you ever seen a fight at school between teachers? Oh, no. Well, the Stone Mountain Middle School in Atlanta, Georgia can now say they are part of that select few. A teacher and a teacher's assistant attacked each other right in front of a classroom full of students.
Well, some students tried to break up the fight, yelling for the teachers to stop and even approaching the brawling women, but were unsuccessful. School staff members had to come in and break the fight up. Well, both women involved were arrested and charged with disorderly conduct.
Well, parents are calling for the two women to be fired. The school sent a letter home to parents notifying them of the incident and assuring them appropriate measures would be taken to assure the safety of their students. Now, part of that letter read, anyone who creates an unsafe learning environment for our students will receive swift disciplinary actions. In Catan, it wasn't clear what exactly those disciplinary actions were, but they said they will deal with it appropriately.
Interesting. Well, something else becoming more common these days, food recalls. The U.S. Food and Drug Administration says frozen tuna sold in Texas, yeah, you heard that right, Texas, California, and Oklahoma grocery stores are being recalled due to the possibility that it is contaminated with hepatitis A virus. Yes, for those who don't know, hepatitis A is a contagious liver disease.
Well, the FDA was made aware of the problem when the Hawaiian Department of Health notified them that frozen tuna cubes from Indonesia had tested positive for hepatitis A. Now, the tuna has been sold at a central market located on North Lamar in Austin, Texas, and it was also sold to the food distributor Cisco Foods, who then sells it to retailers. So no telling just how far and wide that has gone out.
That's right. Symptoms of hepatitis A are stomach pains, jaundice, nausea, loss of appetite, fever, fatigue, and diarrhea. The FDA is urging consumers to seek immediate help from their local healthcare provider if they think they may have gotten sick from eating tainted fish. Well, of course, by that time, it may be too late.
Absolutely. Well, in President Trump's recent meeting with European leaders overseas, he urged them to start paying more to support the NATO army. A recent RT Crosstalk show discussed the possibility of Europe separating itself from relying on its American partner. Take a look at this interview.
The German Chancellor Angela Merkel says we Europeans truly have to take our fate into our own hands, adding we have to fight for our own destiny. Well, indeed, Europe is still relatively rich. Why shouldn't it be more self-reliant? Is this the start of a transatlantic divorce? Europe needs to be more self-reliant, and if NATO is to exist in the way the people in power that want it to exist, they need to pay for it. The people in power that want it to exist, they need to pay for it. That means Germans have to pay more, French have to pay more, Poles, everybody else. Everyone should pay if they feel their security is threatened. So remarkably, we have this moment in history where we have two people diametrically opposed to each other.
Well, I think the audience is looking for clarification and penetrating analysis and understanding of where we're going. And I'm afraid they'll be disappointed by this show, not because of the failures of any of the participants, but because of the complete opaqueness of the meetings that took place this last week. I mean, both the G7 and the NATO meeting. Very little came out of it. In fact, when you mentioned at the start Angela Merkel's remarks, that is virtually these are virtually the only tea leaves we have to understand that there was a very serious conflict between Trump and the European allies. What the nature of that conflict was came out in unconvincing, unpersuasive terms, as covered in the New York Times. That it had to do with global warming, that it had to do with trade rules, and that it had to do, in the terms of NATO, with their contributions.
Is somebody bluffing in this conversation here? I mean, you know, NATO is the pillar of Western security. We've been told that, you know, particularly last 25 years, where it is an alliance looking for a mission, and that mission, I guess, is supposed to defend itself against quote-unquote Russian aggression. Well, do the Europeans want to pay for this? Because a lot of people are saying security against what? What is the risk? And when you make people pay for it, they're going to ask some more penetrating questions and not listen to just propaganda. Go ahead, Ralph in Stuttgart.
Well, Peter, I think it's quite simple. What is happening right now has been overdue for many, many years, if not the last 20 years, because I say when the Iron Curtain came down, it was the moment that the 20th century and the post-war history actually has finished. It has come to a conclusion. Then we had some time where we didn't know what to do with NATO, whether NATO should still exist or not. And first we were offering even to the Russians that they could participate. Then this offer was being withdrawn, and this is where we have a lot of the controversy now. Now, I think, as you said before, there's a window of opportunity here, or a historic moment, kind of, where all the leaders have to reassemble again and regroup, and to say what they want.
When Merkel used the pronoun we, she meant we Europeans. One of the interesting things that the Western media doesn't really talk about very much, that is, you know, if you can continue to try to keep the Russians at bay, you know, keep the Russians out, okay, keep the Americans in and keep the Germans down, this is kind of a defining moment, because is this what Angela Merkel is talking about? Because, you know, if you look at the situation with Russia, and Mr. Trump may be signaling that he's lost interest, then you have a German-centric Germany. Is that something NATO allies have actually thought about? Go ahead, Mark.
Well, I think that's always been the problem. Yes, that whether we talk about NATO or we talk about the EU, one of the reasons why other countries like the Dutch or the Danes or whoever wanted the British in was in order to balance any preponderance of German power, including economic power. For a long time, the Germans under Kohl, and even it seemed at first under Angela Merkel, were basically saying, we don't want to be the leader, we don't want to be the driver of Europe, because we are slightly afraid of what that means. Will our national demons come unstuck and come out into the open again? And now, with her own election coming up in September, she's playing the nationalist card. Maybe she will drop this card once re-elected. But, of course, the situation is changing, as your two other contributors have said, and particularly Donald Trump has thrown down the gauntlet on why do the rich Europeans pay so little for the NATO alliance? Why do the rich Europeans pay so little for the NATO alliance? And of course the big question now is, if, even though they do pay relatively little compared with the States, if we take all the European NATO countries together, they have much more conventional military power than Russia. So if Russia might, in a sense, theoretically pose a threat to a weak neighbour, say Ukraine, it can't really pose a threat to the European NATO allies, because taken together they greatly outnumber the Russian armed forces.
Well, if the United States is going to start some kind of amicable divorce here, isn't it incumbent upon the Europeans, because we have to keep in mind Brexit, for the Europeans to reassess their relationship with Russia? I mean, if the United States isn't going to be in the picture, if the UK isn't going to be in the picture, maybe this would be a good thing. Maybe this would be a fresh start to talk. Go ahead, Gilbert.
Well, the first thing that we have to understand, and I was getting at in my opening remarks, is we don't really know who is running foreign policy in Washington today. Because of the global assault on the Trump administration and the Russiagate campaigners, the administration has gone into double talk, and from one side of the mouth they're saying everything that the hardliners want to hear about. U.S. policy towards Russia and how we're going to step up sanctions and so forth. And from the other side of the mouth, they're speaking to the audience that would like better relations with Russia, and their feet are pointed in the direction of better relations, as we saw from the outcome of the meeting with Lavrov and Kislyak in Donald's office. A week ago or 2 weeks ago, I would have said that Henry Kissinger is steering Donald. That Henry Kissinger is steering Donald, and that was an answer to the remarks that you hear generally that Donald is rattling around in the White House and doesn't have a clue as to what's going on. No, he definitely had a clue, and he wasn't rattling around by himself. We all saw at the meeting with Lavrov that Henry Kissinger was by his side, and the policies that were being put in effect immediately preceding that had the fingerprints of Henry Kissinger all over them. I mean, precisely the attack on Syria, precisely the threat of attack on North Korea. This was realpolitik in action. It was buying time for Donald for the two-week window that he used to overturn in the House the Obamacare legislation, and that was Kissinger. But what's happened now in this last weekend is certainly not Kissinger. Kissinger has been from the very beginning, going back to the 60s and straight through his time and testifying about Russia policy in the 1990s, when the question of Russia admission to NATO was on the agenda. Kissinger has always been in favor of a strong NATO. So the notion of a NATO that is no longer the driving force of U.S. foreign policy, but a much more modest NATO, if a NATO at all, that is not Henry Kissinger. So who exactly is writing our policy?
Well, quite interesting. Different perspectives. Well, Afghanistan has been plagued by violent attacks from terrorists over the last 2 months, costing dozens of lives. In March, a suicide bomber crashed into a minibus in Kabul, targeting state telecom workers. The blast killed 1 person and caused injuries to 19 more.
Then in April, there was a massive attack by the Taliban on a northern army base, which ended in more than 140 people being killed. Now, the Taliban was seeking revenge for the recent deaths of 2 of its officials in the region. Now, that strike is considered to be the bloodiest so far this year.
But it wasn't the last attack. On May 17th, Islamic State assaulted a television station in Jalalabad. 6 people were killed and more than 24 injured. And then just 4 days ago, a suicide car bomber killed at least 18 people in Khost province.
In an RT interview pertaining to this most recent bombing, former Pentagon official Michael Maloof was asked how a truck filled with explosives could get into one of the Afghan's capital's, quote, safe zone. Well, Mr. Maloof gave several explanations, saying it was not checked, it could have had people there who allowed it to go, and it looked innocent enough. So any one of those possibilities, but nevertheless, it got through.
That's right. Well, it was a suicide bombing, he continued. It could have been detonated anywhere. They could have tried to get into areas that were more heavily guarded and were turned back. So the bombing was meant to do as much devastation and civilian casualties as possible.
Well, former State Department official Matthew Ho told RT that the situation in Afghanistan is not improving, basically because they are only using war as a means of solving the problem. Ho said, "You want a war? You'll get a war." The suffering in Afghanistan has been going on for decades. Now, the war has been escalated a number of times, he said, and the results have been the same, which basically that there have been no positive results, only, like you said, escalation and really more war, no problem solving.
Yeah, and it didn't sound like the statement he made was really a solution to the problem as well. Well, for continued coverage and more details on the Afghan bombing, we now turn it over to our correspondent, Larry McGee. Larry, what are the number of current casualties right now?
The suicide truck attack is reported to have killed 90 people and injured almost 400 others, including 11 citizens from the U.S. The bombers used a water delivery truck, which is said to have been on its way to the area of Kabul. The truck was stopped at a checkpoint, and that is where the blast occurred. Authorities say that if it had been able to slip past the checkpoint, the number of those dead might have been significantly higher, possibly affecting many embassies which are also in the area. Tensions are getting higher as North Korea launched its third ballistic missile test in just 3 weeks. The alarm being sounded is that with each test, the DPRK gets closer to achieving missile technology capable of striking the U.S. Reporters say that concern is heightening among American defense officials who believe that with each effort, North Korea gains deeper technical knowledge. Images are circulating from the latest launch, which is being called a success, supervised by the country's President Kim Jong-un. The missile is said to have traveled several hundred miles into the China Sea and ultimately landed between Japan and North Korea. This makes the 9th test in total since the current president took office, and President Trump has been reportedly tweeting his disapproval, while the U.S. has also been testing new missile technology of its own. The U.S.'s missile intercept capabilities were tested for the first time this week, with the mock warhead being launched from a Pacific island and a ground intercept being shot from California. If the intercept is successful, the system's kill vehicle will stop the mock warhead mid-flight over the Pacific. America is reported to have had some successes with regard to short-range tests, but not with long-range tests so far. For YPN News, I'm Larry McGee. Katan Jeff, back to you.
Katan, you can definitely see with all of North Korea's recent missile tests, you can see why the U.S. wants those anti-missile interceptors ready and functioning properly.
Yeah, I bet.
Well, the U.S. has decided to withdraw from the Paris Climate Accord, and this has created a stir with the leaders within the U.S. Now, Democratic governors from California, Washington, and New York said that they will not let the U.S. Back away from a commitment to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and called the president's move insane while vowing to uphold the Paris commitment.
The 3 governors said that they would form a new coalition called the U.S. Climate Alliance. Connecticut and Virginia governors have also expressed interest in joining the pact. And just as a note, Canada, leaders from Canada and Mexico are also a part of that as well. Well, protesters have also been voicing their disapproval for the president's withdrawal from the agreement. In fact, Michael Breen, the president of the Truman National Security Project, said of the president's move, "This is a decision that cedes the leadership of the 21st century to countries like China, to our economic competitors that will have no benefit to the American working class and American economy."
President Trump withdrew, calling the deal unfair to American workers, saying it stifled production and imposed burdens to the country. President Trump's stance on climate change has been harsh at times, calling it a hoax. Well, the U.S. follows just behind China in greenhouse emissions scientists believe is the cause of global warming.
Now, international criticism has been voiced as well due to the president's decision to withdraw from the Paris Agreement. Stefan Dujarric, the UN spokesman, said that the decision was a major disappointment for global efforts to reduce greenhouse emissions and promote international security. As also a reminder, almost every nation agreed to this deal back in 2015, so about 2 years ago, recognizing, as Dujarric said, the enormous impact climate change is having on the entire world.
Well, the new French President Emmanuel Macron said that he respects Trump's decision, but thinks it's a mistake both for the U.S. and our planet. While the Japanese Environmental Minister Koichi Yamamoto said the climate change issue is a global problem and we're calling on the U.S. to cooperate.
Well, Governor Jerry Brown, the governor of the 6th richest economy in the world, California, was heading to Beijing, China to attend a clean energy summit. Governor Brown said Mr. Trump is wrong on the facts, wrong on the science, wrong on the economy, and eventually the Trump administration will have to come around because they can't deviate from the entire world the way that he's trying to now.
Well, lastly, Russia has been in the U.S.'s crosshairs since before the time of the Cold War. Our times have not changed in the last 50 years as Russia has been continuously accused of many things from the U.S. and its allies. Now, Megyn Kelly had an opportunity to pose some of the pressing questions to President Putin regarding the Syrian conflict. Mr. Putin's response was direct and stern. Take a look for yourself.
We know that Assad has used chemical weapons before, and Russia entered into an agreement in 2013 to stop that. I mean, Russia acknowledged that in 2013 when it acknowledged to try to stop that by Assad. The only question is whether he launched the chemical weapons attack that happened a couple of months ago. And I just want to ask you, press you a little further on this, because we all saw the video of the suffering, dying children, and that was the reason that President Trump dropped the bomb. Do you deny, because Assad denies that those tapes are real. He's purporting to tell us not to believe our lying eyes. Do you believe those tapes are fake?
First, when President Obama and I agreed to work together to destroy chemical weapons in Syria, we assumed that Syria had it, but we never recognized that Assad had used it. So please be more precise. Secondly, as for those people who were killed or who suffered because of the use of weapons, including chemical weapons, this is false information. As of now, we are absolutely confident that this is just a provocation. President Assad didn't use chemical weapons. All of this was orchestrated in order to stage him, to accuse him. Moreover, our intelligence services have got information that in other districts of Syria, not far from Damascus, there were plans to reproduce this scenario, and we made these plans publicly. Those who had been planning this action thought it better not to engage in these actions.
If I could just follow up on that, though, because the bodies of the victims were autopsied at Turkey's Ankara Forensic Medicine Institution. The autopsies were witnessed by officials from the World Health Organization and from the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons. And they concluded that the victims were attacked with sarin gas. Are we really to believe that the whole thing was staged, that everybody was in on it? The World Health Organization, the Forensic Medicine Institution, the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons?
The answer is very simple, and you know it. The answer is very simple, and you know it. Yes, sarin could have been used by someone, but not by Assad. It could have been used by someone in order to accuse President Assad. We have to understand who is to blame, and otherwise, if there is no true investigation, it's only going to play into the hands of those who orchestrated it. I'd like to ask you a question. Why didn't everyone go right away to inspect the air base to the spot where chemical weapons allegedly had been used? Why didn't they want to go to see the aircraft that had been allegedly used to perform this strike? The answer is very simple, because they were afraid that everything, the truth, would come to light. What you are telling me doesn't convince me. They were afraid that everything, the truth, would come to light. They were afraid the truth would come to light. The truth would come to light. The truth would come to light of anything. It just persuades me that we'd better not engage in tug of war there or speculate. We've got to pull our efforts together to counter real threats. And we know what these real threats are. The US is very far. Yes, there was an explosion there, people suffered, which we offer our condolences. But we also know what terrorists is all about. We have seen its manifestations. And no one should try to use terrorists to address short-term political interests, even though there are attempts at that. Yes, there are attempts at using terrorists against, say, Assad. Why use them? Because no one else would fight. I do not think it's worthwhile using these terrorists today, because tomorrow it's gonna cost you a lot. When Al-Qaeda was created in Afghanistan to fight against the Soviet Union, they didn't know that it would strike the US on 9/11. We've got to think about negative ramifications in the long term.
Well, it definitely sounds like President Putin is standing his ground on his statements.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Well, it's clear to see that as long as mankind tries to take advantage of his neighbor, as long as there's not a set of rules that everyone can agree on that brings no harm to anyone, including the environment, and as long as today's leaders continue to ignore the voice of reason, our world will never have peace. Well, Yisrael Hawkins is that voice of reason crying out in the wilderness, warning mankind of what their choices will bring and also showing them a way to lasting peace. If you're ready to listen, well, contact the House of Yahweh to find out what you need to do to find true peace. And when you do, don't forget to request your free copy of the monthly newsletter and the Prophetic Word magazine. Here's how.
To contact the House of Yahweh, you can write them at P.O. Box 2498, Abilene, Texas 79604. You can call them at 1-800-613-9494. Visit them on any of their websites, www.yahweh.com, www.yisraelhawkins.com, or www.yahwehsbranch.com. You can also visit our website by going to www.ypnnews.com. If you would like to email the House of Yahweh, you can email them at info@yahweh.com. Any international calls, you can call the number that's on your screen now. And once again, we'd like to remind you of 2 free programs that will help answer all your scriptural questions. Yisrael Says program and the Ask Yisrael program. You can learn about the Yisrael Says program by going to www.yisraelsays.com and the Ask Yisrael program by going to www.askyisrael.com.
But don't go anywhere. Up next, Yisrael Hawkins. From all of us here at YPN News, I'm Katan Alexander.
And I'm Jeffrey Heimerman.
Thank you for watching.